I work for a company called VMware, and I work specifically in a division called Tanzu Labs, where we work in public sector with governments, we work with nonprofits, things like this. And I was working with a large client last year where we were working on some software for them in a mission control setting where they were kind of managing space objects, and that's kind of as far as I can get into the topic. But the software that we had developed for them was in a dark mode setting. It was what we considered a raging success with our users. Our stakeholders were really happy, and it had already been deployed for about a year at the point in time when this talk kind of started to come about. But I was in a stakeholder meeting with a number of folks, and one of the stakeholders was actually a former user who had been promoted. And meeting went fine, we were doing really well, they were very happy with everything. And at the end of the meeting, I could kind of tell that this specific person really had something to say. He was fidgeting, he was wringing his hands, and he says to me, hey, there's one thing that the boys back in the control center really, really want, and we didn't know how to ask for this. And I was like, sure, please tell me. And as we know, like usually when a user has something very acute like this going on, it's a pretty strong smell that there's something that you should be listening to. And he says, we would love it if we could just get a light mode in our application. And this was a surprise because we had designed it in dark mode, we had been testing it, it had been in production for a long period of time. And I knew that I needed to kind of dig a little bit further. I was like, why do you think that you need a light mode? I was kind of in this mindset where I was like, oh, you silly user, let's talk about why dark mode is better in your situation versus light mode. And he says, the part that I was really surprised about, well, dark mode's really hurting our eyes. By the end of our shift, our eyes are red, we're really struggling with it. It's great up on the big screens. Whenever we're using it on our smaller terminals, it's really, really difficult to read it. And this was a huge, huge shock to me at this point in time, because this kind of runs counter to what a lot of us assume about dark mode. So at this point in time, I decided to go do some research, find out if there was any evidence around eye strain in dark mode. And this led me down a multi-month path where I had to really dig in to what I knew about dark mode and some of my assumptions about it. So for those of you who don't know, there's this concept called first principles, where if you have a set of assumptions about something and you're finding a solution not working, you need to start challenging all of those assumptions and questioning them. And this isn't just a matter of questioning one assumption on a very surface level, but really kind of digging down into it. Once you find some fundamental truths, then you'll tend to break down your solution and kind of start from scratch. So after doing this, after reading about 20 or 30 research papers, finding articles, videos, and trying to understand everything I could about dark mode, I mostly came to one conclusion about it, and that it's kind of bullshit. I know it's a bit of a surprise, but there's some positives here, don't worry. But ultimately what we're going to be doing during this talk is discussing some of the assumptions that we make about dark mode, how we should be approaching those things, and in the future, whenever we're coming across certain similar situations, how do we deal with these things? So we can't know the scope of our assumptions until we define the subject itself. So the first one I want to get into is, what is dark mode? We talk about this a lot. I think everyone has a mental model of what dark mode is, but I realized that I needed to understand this question before I went any farther. So obviously, dark mode is an interface with a negative contrast polarity. The next question people usually would ask me is, what is contrast polarity? Now, contrast polarity really is nothing more than the level of contrast between the foreground or subject and the background of a given interface or a visual element. So as an example, here is our foreground or our subject, who is the person taking the photo. Our background is dark, all right? So our background is darker than our foreground. So the two terms that I came across, and this was something that was the first thing I needed to discover, because when I first was looking at dark mode in a research setting, I was really shocked at how little there was on that topic. But once I found these two terms, this really is what sent me down the path. But negative polarity is essentially where your background is darker than your foreground. Positive polarity is the inverse of that. You're going to be hearing these a couple times throughout this talk. And then just for some quick context, I want to have folks understand the history of dark mode itself, where does it come from? Why do we even have it in the first place? Is it a relatively new thing? And the answer is no, it is very old, very, very old. As a matter of fact, the first monitors that we had were in dark mode. They were cathode ray tube monitors. They used a single illuminating color to provide that contrast, and this is kind of how computers worked for quite a while when we were dealing with terminals themselves. Matter of fact, those of you have probably, well, some of you have seen the movie War Games. This is the kind of situation where dark mode really, I feel, developed some of its cool, sexy factor, right? It's here to do work. It's here to do very important things. And it looks really, really cool in this situation where it's up on the big monitors and it looks like it's very super serious. But when we get into like the mid and late 80s, early 90s, is where we started to see computer monitors developing, we could display more than just simple colors, right? This is where we started to see a big shift in some of the mindset of why we went away from dark mode. Personal computers at home had color monitors, so as people got more and more excited about that, we switched over to positive polarity displays, and then in office environments where terminals used to exist, these were also quickly switched out as well. So now that we kind of have a good understanding of what we mean by dark mode and kind of its history, I want to look at some of the assumptions around it. And again, as I mentioned, we really want to look at all the operating assumptions that we have about it, and we don't want to assume any assumption is too trivial. This was actually something that kind of caught me up at first, because I made a lot of assumptions about what I knew, and then I really had to kind of break those down. So what are the advantages or the assumptions about dark mode that most of us hold? The first one is that it's for work. Users are more performant when they are using a dark mode application. I've heard this one tons of times, especially in government work. It's best for reading in low light. It reduces eye strain. It improves battery life. It lowers the risk of myopia. It looks super sexy, is honestly the one that most people come to. And honestly, when we kind of go through all of these, I'm going to kind of a little bit of a spoiler alert here. The first three don't work out so well. The last three are really the true ones in terms of dark mode itself. But before we get into some of the research papers and some of the findings that I find that it's good to kind of give a primer on how we process visual information. I don't want to make too many assumptions about what folks in the room know. But there's two forms of vision that we have as human beings, and honestly most mammals in general. We have what's called our foveal or our primary vision. This is what our focus fixates on. This is really good for high levels of detail, for reading, for analyzing things, and really kind of like breaking it down. So anything where discrimination of data or analysis of the data is really where our primary or foveal vision really comes into play. Our second type of vision that we have is our peripheral vision. This is really the rest of our visual range. So if I'm looking at someone in the back and I'm focusing on their face right now, everyone else is kind of falling into my periphery. Now, my periphery isn't as clear and as focused as my foveal vision is. And it's honestly, back one, there we go. But it's really good for detecting changes in luminosity or changes in motion. I run a fencing school in Denver, and one of the things that I tell my fencing students is not to look at their opponent with their primary vision, but instead to look past their opponent and use their periphery, because it's much easier to track motion than focusing on, say, the tip of a weapon. So to kind of give folks an example, in case we have really that understanding of this yet, our foveal vision here is focusing on a person's face, whereas our peripheral vision is blurry, all right? And the way of kind of thinking of this is that our primary vision is going to bounce around a given scene and focus on certain things that it finds important, and then it's just going to simply defocus everything else because it's in the periphery at that point in time. So as you can see here, it kind of jumps around. As a interface example, and we also have pre-attentive processing that goes on in our vision. This means that we look at a scene or we look at a view, our brain literally will take about between 2 and 500 milliseconds to process that scene and say to itself, hey, what should we pay attention to? What should we fixate on? And in this example, it's going to probably usually focus on something that's the strongest in that scene or that interface. such as graphs, things that may change due to animation, or maybe even primary interactions that I need to take on that page itself. All right? So now that we have a good idea about what dark mode is, how our vision works, we can now start to dig into the research itself. Now, fair warning, some of this is fairly dry. I'm going to try to break this down as much as possible. And for those of you who haven't read research papers before, this is usually the kind of titles that you will get for them. So very easy to understand and read, especially when you're digging through a bunch of these and trying to figure out which are the ones that you should be paying attention to the most. This can be a little bit of a struggle. But the first paper that we get into here is the advantages of positive tech background polarity is due to high display luminance and ergonomics. And in this paper, the experiments were conducted with proofreading tasks. So they were asking people to read and detect errors in proofreading. And this is kind of a very common way of looking at interface research. So the monitors were set up to either high or low luminance, which means that they either had a lot of light coming out of them or low light coming out of them. And they also looked at negative and positive polarity displays in both of those settings. So here are the results. And I'm sure everyone in here can understand these results right off the bat and see how compelling they are. So don't worry, we're going to break this down into some of the text. But ultimately, kind of what happened is we didn't see as much of a difference between light mode and dark mode in these situations, or light and dark polarities. This kind of suggested to them that the positive polarity advantage is actually due to higher luminance than the positive polarity display. So in this situation, they found that proofreading was easier to do when there was a lot of light coming off of the monitor, but it had nothing to do necessarily with it being positive or negative in its polarity itself. So the readability presented on the screens was better when the luminance was high, but display polarity didn't affect readability. So this is kind of one of the first things that we hear about dark mode, right? It's easier to read in low light situations. But here we have a place where even in a situation where the light was coming off of the screen in dark mode, we were struggling with this. So the translation of this is total screen luminance is the primary factor that actually affects readability, whereas polarity and positive polarity just tend to put out more luminance. So we do see some advantages in positive polarity displays when it comes to reading, and the assumption is that this is because a positive polarity display is putting out more light. So why does luminance improve readability in the first place? For folks who don't know, our eye, we hear this analogy a fair amount, that our eye is like a camera. And this is not a simple analogy, it's pretty direct, in the sense that when our pupil is constricted, less light is coming into our eye. So in the same way with a camera, where I may lower the amount of light coming into the lens, this actually still increases the amount of visual fidelity I'm getting into my eye. So here on the left, we see a pupil that's constricted. The sky, I can see a lot of detail in the sky, whereas everything else where I'm not getting a lot of light is kind of washed out. In the middle frame, we see that our pupil is adjusted, so it's kind of in a nice balance, but the sky is fairly washed out. And then when our pupil is dilated, where a lot of light is coming in, we see that our highlights are all washed out. It's kind of hard to see the scene. So again, very, very similar to a camera and how the lens operates. The next paper we're going to look at is the effect of pupil size and peripheral brightness on detection and discrimination performance. This is one of my favorite ones here, and two terms I want to disambiguate really quick is detection is the ability to recognize new information or objects, so merely recognizing that something has changed in a scene or a view. Whereas discrimination is our ability to read or analyze content or data. So in this study, there's a bunch of different experiments that were done. I'm going to focus on two of them, but both of them were had participants asked to fixate on a central point on a screen, on an interface, and stare at it for about 500 milliseconds. Then the situation changed for them. The polarities that they looked at were dark, medium, and light, and this is actually the interface that they presented to the users. I'm just imagining someone walking into a situation with just this on the screen, and they're being asked to stare at it for half a second or so and wondering what they're doing with their lives. In experiment C, which was one of the first ones that was really important to us, they were asked to fixate on that target point that they saw for about 500 milliseconds. The target would then fade away, and then a series of letters would appear in its place. And all they were asked to do is it a word or is it a pseudo word? And for those of you who don't know, a pseudo word is really nothing more than something that looks like it makes sense, but when you actually read it, it's just gobbledygook at that point. So the way they looked at this was essentially having you stare at the screen, waiting about a second or so for the target to fade away, then the word or not word would show up. And the goal of the user at this point was to identify if it was a word or a not word as fast as possible, and they recorded those times as they were identifying these. The second experiment that they looked at was instead a discrimination task. Same scenario, they'd look at the target would then fade away, and then in place of the target, a word would show up. And they would kind of bounce between the two, where it would fade out the word, fade it back in, it would fade in and out the target and asking them. And their goal was just simply to identify what the word was, or detect when the word showed up. So this is kind of how that's played out. I just love, again, I'm staring at the middle of the screen, and the word apple is just showing up every once in a while. I'm clicking a button, and that's my life. The results of this one were fairly interesting. They found that small pupils did increase visual acuity, so again, constriction of the pupil, and this improved discrimination of the fine stimuli. So again, really looking at the words, identifying if it was a word or a non-word. Large pupils increased the amount of light coming into the eye, and this improved detection of faint stimuli. Now, so far, this doesn't seem too crazy for us. This seems, makes sense what we were talking about in terms of the camera. But they further found that the pupil size was larger during detection tasks than during discrimination tasks. Now, this is where it got actually really interesting, because essentially what they are saying is that it had nothing to do with the interface, the polarity of the interface, in terms of how well they performed in discrimination and detection tasks. It had more to do with what their brain was thinking the task was. So when they were being asked a task to discriminate or analyze words, their pupil would naturally constrict. When they were asked to detect if a word existed or not, their pupil would naturally dilate. And again, this had nothing to do with it being in a positive or negative polarity. This had more to do with the mental model of the user itself. This is where I started to get a little excited that I was finding something interesting. So again, while light input into the eye may affect pupil size, the larger factor was actually the task type for the user. So again, our eyes are going to adapt to the task rather than necessarily to the environment that we may be in. So, as I said, discrimination tasks are going to benefit from positive polarity, detection from negative polarity. Next paper we're going to look at here is background polarity affects performance irrespective of ambient illumination and color contrast. Again, I wish they'd come up with something a little more catchy and simpler than this. Here, users were asked to proofread in a typical office illumination setting, in a control room setting that was really bright. In dark rooms, they were asked to do this in a number of different illumination settings. This is getting to how good they were able to read things in the ambient situation, regardless necessarily of the polarity itself, although it certainly is a part of this. So after the sessions that they went through in terms of proofreading all of these words, they were asked, how are your muscles in your back feeling? How are your eyes feeling? Are you fatigued? Any headaches? All these kind of things. That was all fun stuff. I was less interested in those. I was more interested in the performance of the users themselves. But just to kind of show you, here are some of the results that they got in things like headache. You'll see here that, again, they're looking at situations where it was a black and white or a negative positive polarity display. They also looked at polarities in terms of chromatic availability, so essentially how much saturation of color was in the interface itself. But you're not going to see a lot of change here outside of the blue and yellow, which I am not going to talk about today. Eye strain, this is again the one that we talk about in terms of dark mode. We don't see much of a change here between the polarities, nor do we see necessarily a change in between the illuminance settings that they're in. So proofreading accuracy, discrimination performance was actually unaffected by the ambient illuminance. And it wasn't affected by chromatic or achromatic variance, which means, again, the amount of color in the interface itself. There were no significant differences between negative and positive polarities on various strains of strain or fatigue. So this is really now where we're getting into kind of where I was like, hold on, what are we talking about here? Because, we've all heard that dark mode hurts the light mode hurts our eyes, whereas dark mode is something that's actually really easy on our eyes. This is where I started to dig down into this hole a little bit more because this is really kind of confusing, right? So where does the idea that light mode causes more eye strain come from? You'd be surprised how hard it was to actually find some answers on this. But I then, of course, went and looked at that same paper that we were just talking about, and there was a little clue in this paper that I found really fascinating. They looked at a paper from the 80s by a man named Cushman, 1984, that had an exception to some of the patterns that they were seeing. And they say here that he had reported no significant polarity-related difference in reading times and comprehension, but he did report that there were differences in eye strain between negative and positive polarities in the interfaces. This is the only paper I could find that actually supported the idea that light mode may cause eye strain. The problem was that I couldn't find it anywhere. So I had to do some additional digging. It's actually really hard to find something that's mostly found on microfiche these days. But I was able to actually finally find the paper, and it's called literally Reading from Microfiche, a Visual Display Terminal, and the Printed Page, and this is all about subject fatigue and performance itself. Now, Cushman does get into a fair amount of interesting stuff about this, but we're not going to dig too much. But they were essentially reading long-form material, doing this on positive, negative displays. They were doing this on microfiche, and they were doing it on printed paper as well. And again, proofreading tasks seem to be the best way to test some of this stuff out, obviously since the 80s. So Cushman was really interesting because reading the paper, he does in fact say that light mode did show some increases in eye strain, and then come his caveats that nobody seems to ever talk about. And here he says, however, extrapolation of the results regarding ocular discomfort and general fatigue to other environments and displays with different characteristics cannot be done without significant risk or error. The display design affects the likelihood that flicker will be perceivable for that luminance, which in turn affects the probability that a user will have some discomfort. So this is where it gets really, really interesting in terms of where this idea comes from. And essentially what he's saying to us is, hey, on visual display terminals, there's screen flicker that's going on. And this screen flicker is what's actually hurting people's eyes. Now, CRT monitors had a fair amount of screen flicker back in the day, and this was actually worsened by light mode situations where we were dealing with those positive polarity displays. Because more light is coming out, we are actually receiving more of that flickering that's going on, and that's exacerbating the eye strain that we're getting. So Cushman is essentially telling us, hey, this is probably caused by screen flicker. In the future, nobody should make this assumption that light mode actually hurts eyes. And everyone just kind of forgot that part and moved on. But I wanted to still look at maybe there are still some things that are causing people to make some of these assumptions. And I mean in terms of users themselves. I've had lots of users who ask for dark mode because they heard that it makes their eyes better. It makes it easier to read. Where are people getting some of this from? I've had actually some developers at our company who challenged me on this entire talk because they work in dark mode all the time, and when they switch to light mode, their eyes suddenly hurt, so it has to be true. So I made some potential assumptions that needed some further investigation around this idea. That constant dilation or constriction of the eye, so for instance, if I'm working in a dark environment and I'm looking at a positive polarity display, and then I walk away and I'm in that dark environment, my eye is constantly dilating and constricting. That can certainly cause eye strain. Obviously, the CRT monitor situation can cause eye strain. Long sessions, fixating on things, essentially discrimination tasks, long sessions naturally hurt the eyes. This has been shown in everything from sewing to driving to using your computer. So it has really less to do with light mode, more to do with discrimination. And then there was one more thing that I thought might actually be causing some of this as well. I want to be clear, this is not scientific, but it is something that I think does play into this a little bit. For those of you who've probably been on Dribble, You've seen plenty of dark mode ideas out there. A fair amount of dark mode applications have some level of chromatic or color in them. It's not just a simple matter of neutral tones of grays and blacks. There's a lot of dark blues, a lot of dark purples, a fair amount of color saturation going on. I want to perform a experiment with y'all here, which may not work, but we're going to find out. So I want everyone to kind of stare at the screen really, really hard, focus in on one of the birds, and just really kind of look at it. Keep your eyes open and try not to blink as much as you can. All right, now I want you to continue looking at the screen at the same spot you were just looking at. Do not look away. You should, hopefully, and when you do this on an actual computer at home, it will work. You'll see some fading going on, where essentially the birds will still be there. You'll see some of the reds and the greens. And what happens here, essentially, is when you're looking at a lot of color saturation in a situation like that, your photoreceptors for color actually get fatigued faster than your color receptors for luminance. So black and white actually get tired less than your receptors for color, all right? So this may be playing into if we have dark mode situations where we have a fair amount of color saturation, even in our neutral tones, this can potentially affect some of our users as well. There's some papers in here that I was just kind of looking through. But essentially, high ambient color saturation and interface can fatigue our receptors. So I have some design recommendations here that I want to kind of go through, and this also includes some things from some of the papers I didn't include in this talk today. But there's some fascinating things that I really wanted to kind of look at. The first one here is obviously, instead of thinking about dark and light mode being used in the ambient situation that a user is in, instead, we should be using them in terms of what tasks our users may be actually doing. So if our users are maybe saying responding to phone calls, or they need to make quick decisions about things and deal with tasks as they come up, detection may be a better thing for them, right? That's the type of task that they're in. Dark mode actually may work well for them. Light mode really should be used more in situations where folks need to read or discriminate data. So I'm looking at a big table of information, and I need to figure out what my next task is going to be, should probably be in light mode. If I'm having to read for a long period of time, should probably be in light mode. But if I have a mix of those two, maybe what I need to do is not determine if my app needs to be in light mode or dark mode. Maybe instead it needs to be on the task level itself. And this is something that we had just started to experiment with recently in the past few months, where, for instance, we'd have certain parts of the application in light mode, so all the places where I need to do reading were in positive polarity situations, whereas all of our task bars or places where alerts would pop up or things that needed immediate action were kind of all in that negative polarity. And we've seen some benefits in that, but it's not totally conclusive yet. This is a different way of thinking about light and dark mode than what most people think, all right? Some of the other things I think that are important for folks to understand, that again comes from the research that I was seeing, we want to make sure that we're using stronger typefaces rather than thinner ones when contrast is important. Even in a dark mode situation where we have a fairly high level of contrast ratio, stronger typefaces are going to perform better for us than lighter ones will. Negative polarities are going to always require a higher contrast ratio than your positive polarities. One of the mistakes I see a lot of designers make when they're designing light and dark modes is they'll design light mode, they'll basically take some of their color values, invert them into dark mode. Technically speaking, the contrast ratio is the same, and they kind of move on. This is not a really positive way of handling this. You actually need a higher contrast ratio in those situations. Also, less color in your dark modes is going to benefit your users, and this is something that we did see as we made some adjustments for those users in mission control that we were talking about. So for instance, taking out, as we're getting farther and farther into the interface, what I mean is, if I'm looking at my foreground, we can have some color in there, but as I move closer to the background, reducing that saturation as much as possible. And then, as a matter of fact, as I was going through this research and digging into it and finding some interesting things, I actually came across a new model for contrast ratios. Most folks use the WCAG model. We've all probably done it. You know, we look at AA and AAA, and we kind of like pat ourselves in the back that we met our contrast ratios. But the new model, as ugly as this is, And this is my favorite one. But there are much sexier versions of this, but I refuse to use them simply because this is glorious. I don't know who made it, but it was probably a developer. But the nice thing about this new color contrast model is that it's not just looking at the color values or the size of the text. It's also looking at the weight of the text. And this will actually break it down for you. So not only will you see what size of a font needs to be in order to still be readable at a given contrast ratio, you also see what font weights work at different contrast ratios. As a matter of fact, this new APCA model is something that is being built into Chrome by Google. A number of other folks are adopting this fairly fast. And I've actually taken some of my older contrast ratios from other older projects, ran that through this, and seen some pretty big benefits to my users because of it. So the last thing I want to talk about, I know that we probably have time for some QA at the end of this, as we're a little bit ahead of schedule, is that I think one of the biggest things for us as designers that we kind of need to get over is that it's okay to be wrong about design. Sometimes, we talk about let's make mistakes, let's, admit when we're wrong, or when, user tests fail, we should feel good about that. That's all fine and good, but sometimes when we're dealing with our stakeholders or our clients or our management teams, we get into a place where we have to advocate for design so much that we forget to talk about when design can potentially be wrong. And I've found that being vulnerable in those situations and admitting that I've made a mistake or that I didn't have perfect knowledge at the time and now I have something that's more perfect, for lack of a better thing, that I actually get more trust from my stakeholders and my clients than if I'm only in the mode of defending my design all the time, all right? So being a little bit more vulnerable, being a little bit more curious about the things that we hear from our users may lead us into some really exciting places in the future. And I want everyone here to, as you go through and you hear things from users about, hey, this runs contrary to your design ideas, but I have this problem with this, don't just look at it as your user maybe being wrong or maybe being misinformed, but instead go on a journey and find out what the truth is. You might be really surprised what you find. Thank you.